Detective J.T. Brown always prided himself on his ability to connect the smallest details in every case. But the disappearance of Edwardine Williams struck him as unusual the moment he received the report. Edwardine, a devoted mother and the center of her small family, had vanished without a trace. Her car was found abandoned 3 miles from her home, the doors unlocked, but everything inside from her phone to cash and documents was intact. Her purse was discovered nearby, tied securely to a tree, as if someone deliberately left a message. But what was the message? Someone wanted us to notice these details, Brown thought, his eyes fixed on the scene. However, there were no signs of violence. This wasn't a robbery. That only made the case stranger. As Brown began his investigation, the list of people connected to the case quickly expanded. The first focal point of suspicion was Terry Ellison, Edwardine's eldest son. Terry was the last known person to see his mother before her disappearance. When summoned for questioning, he appeared tense and vague in his answers. Terry claimed his mother had simply said she needed a few days to think and left without revealing her destination. "You don't find it strange that your mother left without telling her daughters or her family?" Brown asked, his gaze steady. Terry shook his head, avoiding direct eye contact. "She does that sometimes. She just needs time to herself." But that answer didn't satisfy Brown. Terry's evasiveness left him convinced the man knew more than he let on. Meanwhile, other lines of inquiry led Brown to interview Tara Kennedy, Terry's ex-wife. Tara's testimony painted a chilling picture of Terry's past, marked by violence and control. She recounted how he was not only short-tempered, but had also threatened and strangled her during arguments. "He has a habit of choking when he's angry," Tara said, her voice trembling. "I thought he'd kill me if I tried to leave him." These revelations forced Brown to reconsider the case. He couldn't ignore the parallels between Terry's violent tendencies and Edwardine's death, later revealed to be caused by strangulation. Even so, Terry continued to deny any involvement and refused to cooperate. The turning point in the investigation came when Brown's team uncovered a critical clue in the ashes of a backyard burn pit behind Edwardine's home: a Betty Boop keychain. It was the keychain Edwardine always kept with her car keys. There's only one way this keychain could have made it back to the house, Brown thought. The person who last saw her alive brought it here. Confronted with this undeniable evidence, Terry was arrested. Throughout the investigation and trial, he continued to deny the crime, blaming mysterious people or imaginary boyfriends of his mother. But these excuses failed to convince the jury. In the end, Terry was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. For Brown, this case wasn't just a professional victory but a sobering reminder of family tragedy. "Not all crimes come from strangers," he wrote in his final report. "Sometimes the devil hides in those we think we know best." Detective J.T. Brown couldn't shake the lingering questions that remained after Terry Ellison's conviction. Despite the jury's unanimous decision and the wealth of evidence, something about the case felt incomplete. Reviewing the file again late one night, Brown found his attention drawn to Edwardine's phone records. There, buried in the logs, was a recurring unsaved number, a burner phone. This detail had been overlooked during the initial investigation, but now it burned brightly as a lead. The number led Brown to Wayne Black, a long-haul truck driver who had been a friend of Edwardine's for years. Wayne had cooperated during the initial investigation, insisting he hadn't spoken to her recently. But the call logs revealed otherwise. When confronted, Wayne reluctantly admitted Edwardine had called him multiple times in the weeks before her death. "She was scared," Wayne said, his voice trembling. "She told me Terry had been acting different, drinking more, losing his temper." Brown listened intently as Wayne recounted how Edwardine had confided her fears about her son's growing instability. She had contemplated leaving the house but felt guilty about abandoning Terry. "I told her she could stay with me," Wayne added. "But she said she couldn't just leave him like that. He needed her." The detective couldn't ignore the tension in Wayne's words. Was this the voice of a concerned friend? Or was there something more he wasn't saying? Brown probed further, asking about their relationship, But Wayne stuck to his story. They were nothing more than friends. Still, Brown felt the weight of uncertainty. Wayne's name remained in the back of his mind as he continued to unravel the tangled web of Edwardine's final days. Returning to Edwardine's home, Brown reviewed the crime scene photos once again. Among the evidence catalogued from Terry's burn pit was a document fragment belonging to Edwardine's late husband, Michael. It was odd. These documents had no apparent value, and Edwardine had been known to cherish anything tied to Michael. Why would Terry destroy them? The act felt deliberate, as if Terry was attempting to erase something or someone from memory. Brown's instincts pointed him back to Terry's relationship with Michael. Digging deeper, he uncovered old police reports of domestic disturbances involving Terry during Michael's illness. Witnesses described heated arguments and Terry's growing resentment over the attention Michael received from Edwardine. When questioned further, Terry's ex-wife, Tara, revealed a chilling insight. Terry always felt like his mom chose Michael over him, she said. He never got over it. He used to say Michael was the reason his family fell apart. This revelation painted a clearer picture of Terry's motives. Edwardine's loyalty to Michael, even after his death, had become a source of festering resentment for Terry. It wasn't just anger at his stepfather, it was the perception that his mother had abandoned him emotionally. A final piece of evidence sealed the case. Hidden in a storage box retrieved from Terry's room was a journal. In its pages, Terry detailed his feelings of betrayal and his growing rage toward his mother. The entries became darker as they approached the date of Edwardine's disappearance, culminating in a final, cryptic note: "She'll finally understand what she's done." Armed with this evidence, Brown revisited the timeline of Edwardine's disappearance. On the night she vanished, neighbors had reported hearing a loud argument coming from the house. Coupled with the forensic findings, the timeline was clear. In a fit of rage, Terry had confronted Edwardine, likely over an imagined slight. The confrontation escalated, ending in her strangulation. Terry had then staged the scene, abandoning her car to mislead investigators and returning home to burn evidence that connected her to Michael. The journal entries were the final nail in the coffin. They painted a vivid picture of Terry's deteriorating mental state and his fixation on his mother's perceived betrayal. Presented in court, this evidence solidified the prosecution's case. The jury returned a swift guilty verdict, sentencing Terry to life in prison without parole. For Detective Brown, the case left a heavy mark. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime, but the devastating reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from strangers, but from within the walls of our own homes. As he closed the file for the last time, he couldn't help but reflect on Edwardine's tragedy, a life cut short by the son she had loved and protected to the very end. Detective J.T. Brown thought the case was over after Terry Ellison was sentenced to life in prison. Yet, months later, an unexpected call reopened the wounds of the investigation. It was Tabitha, Edwardine's eldest daughter. "Detective Brown," Tabitha began, her voice strained. "I found something in my mom's things, something you need to see." Brown met Tabitha at her family's now abandoned home. She handed him a box of Edwardine's belongings, one she had been too heartbroken to sort through until now. Inside was a stack of handwritten letters. They were addressed to someone named R.B. The letters were fragmented but hinted at a strained relationship, filled with vague references to debts, threats, and secrets Edwardine had been hiding. One line stood out: "I've done everything you asked, but I can't keep covering for him. It's too dangerous now." Brown immediately connected the initials R.B. to Edwardine's brother, Robert Creel. During the original investigation, Robert had raised some suspicion for delaying the missing person report, but his alibi had checked out. However, these letters suggested a deeper involvement. Brown reopened the file and began re-examining Robert's role. He interviewed old neighbors and acquaintances, piecing together fragments of Robert's life. What emerged was a pattern of manipulation and control. Robert, it seemed, had relied heavily on Edwardine for financial and emotional support. But the letters hinted at something darker: Edwardine was protecting someone. Could it have been Terry? Or was there another layer to the story? Digging into Robert's finances, Brown discovered a series of loans and debts tied to a local underworld figure. Edwardine's savings records also revealed large, unexplained withdrawals in the months before her death, withdrawals that coincided with Robert's financial troubles. When confronted, Robert was defensive. "I didn't kill my sister," he shouted, his face red with anger. "I might have borrowed money from her, but that's it. She was family. I loved her." But Brown wasn't convinced. The letters painted Robert not as a protective brother, but as a man desperate and willing to use his sister as a shield. One line in particular gnawed at Brown: "I can't keep covering for him." Who was Edwardine referring to? The breakthrough came when Brown revisited the crime scene logs. Among the items recovered near Edwardine's car was an old cigarette butt. It had been dismissed as unrelated, but advances in DNA technology now allowed the police to test it. The results were shocking. The DNA matched Robert Creel. When confronted with this evidence, Robert's facade crumbled. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he confessed, tears streaming down his face. He admitted that he had confronted Edwardine the night she disappeared, desperate for more money to pay off his debts. When she refused, the argument escalated. Terry, who had been drinking heavily, overheard and joined the fray. According to Robert, Terry exploded in anger, accusing Edwardine of always choosing others over him. The confrontation turned violent, and Terry strangled Edwardine in a fit of rage. Robert, panicking, helped Terry stage the scene, abandoning the car and scattering her belongings to mislead investigators. "I didn't kill her," Robert insisted, "but I didn't stop him either. I should have done something. I should have." Brown listened silently, his stomach knotting. The truth was as devastating as it was tragic. Robert's inaction had enabled Terry's violence, and both men were complicit in Edwardine's death. With this new confession, Robert Creel was charged with accessory to murder and obstruction of justice. For Tabitha and her sister Anne, the revelation reopened old wounds, but it also brought closure. They had lost their mother to the very people who should have loved her the most. Detective Brown filed his final report on the case, reflecting on the layers of betrayal that had unraveled before him. The tragedy of Edwardine Williams was not just a story of murder. It was a cautionary tale about how love, when twisted by greed and anger, can lead to destruction. As he closed the case for the last time, Brown could only hope that the Williams family, despite everything, might one day find peace. Months after Robert Creel's confession and conviction, Detective J.T. Brown found himself revisiting the case yet again. It wasn't out of professional obligation, but a lingering sense of unease. The threads of the story had been tied up in court, yet something about Edwardine Williams' tragic end felt unresolved. Brown's instincts were confirmed when Anne, Edwardine's youngest daughter, reached out. "Detective, I've been thinking a lot about Uncle Robert's confession," she said over the phone, her voice wavering. "There's something I haven't told you." Anne explained that a few weeks before Edwardine's disappearance, she had overheard a heated argument between her mother and her uncle. Edwardine had accused Robert of bringing danger to her doorstep, mentioning a name Kyle. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Anne admitted, "but now I can't stop wondering who Kyle is." Brown took this lead seriously. Running the name through police databases, he found several matches, but one stood out: Kyle Mathers, a known enforcer for a local loan shark. Mathers had a history of violence, and his name had appeared in Robert Creel's financial records as a creditor. Brown tracked down Mathers, who initially denied any connection to Edwardine. But as Brown pressed, Mathers' bravado began to crack. "Look, I didn't kill her," he finally admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "But yeah, I was there that night." According to Mathers, he had been sent by his boss to collect a debt from Robert. When he arrived at Edwardine's house, Robert was already in a panic. Mathers said Edwardine confronted him, refusing to let her brother drag her further into his mess. Things escalated when Terry appeared, clearly intoxicated. Terry started yelling, saying we were all using his mom, Mathers said. "Next thing I know, He's got his hands around her neck. Mathers claimed he tried to intervene, but Terry was out of control. After Edwardine collapsed, Robert begged Mathers to help him cover it up. Mathers agreed, but only to protect himself. "I didn't want my boss knowing I was involved in something like that." Mathers' account filled in crucial gaps in the timeline, confirming that Edwardine's death was not a premeditated murder but a volatile eruption of anger and desperation. With Mathers' testimony, Brown revisited Robert and Terry's actions after Edwardine's death. Investigators uncovered new evidence, surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showing Robert purchasing duct tape and gloves shortly after the time of the crime. This placed him more directly in the cover-up and contradicted his earlier claims of panic-driven complicity. Armed with this new evidence, prosecutors pursued additional charges against both Robert and Mathers. While Mathers cooperated in exchange for a reduced sentence, Robert's legal troubles deepened. Terry, already serving a life sentence, was confronted with the full weight of his actions during a follow-up interview. For the first time, Terry broke down. "I didn't mean to kill her," he sobbed. "I just wanted her to listen to me for once." Brown felt no satisfaction in Terry's remorse. The damage had already been done, and Edwardine's death had fractured a family beyond repair. In the aftermath, Brown closed the case file for good. The layers of deceit and violence had finally been peeled back to reveal the tragic truth. Edwardine had been a victim not just of her son's anger but of a web of desperation and selfishness woven by those closest to her. Reflecting on the case, Brown wrote in his final report, "Justice may have been served, but peace will take much longer to find." The wounds inflicted by this tragedy cut deeper than any courtroom can heal. For the Williams family, the truth brought both closure and pain. Tabitha and Anne vowed to rebuild their lives, carrying their mother's memory as a reminder of the strength she had always shown. As for Detective Brown, the case left him with a grim realization: sometimes the most haunting crimes aren't committed by strangers, but by those we trust the most. Detective J.T. Brown thought the case of Edwardine Williams had finally reached its conclusion. But several months later, an unexpected lead emerged, forcing him to reopen old wounds. One afternoon, Brown received a call from a former informant who had connections in the local underworld. The informant mentioned that Kyle Mathers, who had cooperated with authorities during the case, had been overheard boasting about keeping secrets that even the cops don't know. Brown's instincts kicked in. Mathers had already implicated himself in Robert and Edwardine's murder cover-up. But what if there was more? He decided to pay Mathers a visit, this time unannounced. Mathers was visibly uneasy when Brown showed up at his doorstep. "What now, detective?" he asked, forcing a smirk. Brown didn't bother with pleasantries. "I've been hearing things, Kyle," Brown said, leaning closer, "about secrets you've been keeping. If there's something you haven't told us, now's the time to come clean." Mathers tried to wave it off. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I told you everything." Brown's gaze didn't waver. "If you're lying, Kyle, it won't take long for me to find out. And when I do, you'll be facing charges for perjury and obstruction. You think your deal will hold up then?" Mathers' bravado crumbled. He slumped into his chair, muttering curses under his breath. All right, he finally said. "But you're not going to like it." Mathers revealed that, in the weeks leading up to Edwardine's murder, Robert Creel had been under intense pressure from his creditors. But there was one name Mathers hadn't mentioned before, a man known only as the judge. According to Mathers, the judge was a shadowy figure who oversaw high-stakes illegal dealings in the area. Robert had reportedly borrowed a large sum of money from him and was struggling to repay it. He was desperate, Mathers said. He kept saying Edwardine had to help him, or the judge would come after both of them. Brown's mind raced. If the judge had been involved, it could explain why Edwardine had felt increasingly trapped and fearful. But Mathers' information was frustratingly vague. The judge was a ghost, operating behind layers of intermediaries, and no one seemed to know his real identity. Determined to uncover the truth, Brown began digging into Robert's financial records once more. This time he focused on tracing the origin of the loans. His investigation led him to a series of offshore accounts and shell companies, all pointing back to one name, Clarence Bell, a retired lawyer who had once been a prominent figure in the local judiciary. Brown confronted Bell at his lavish suburban home. "Detective, I have no idea what you're talking about," Bell said, his tone dripping with mock sincerity. But as Brown laid out the evidence, a trail of transactions linking Bell's accounts to Robert Creel, Bell's composure faltered. "Let me make this simple for you," Brown said, his voice cold. "If you don't start talking, I'll make sure your name is on every warrant, subpoena, and indictment I file from now until the day I retire." Bell sighed, the weight of years of secrets finally bearing down on him. "Fine," he said. "I facilitated the loans, but I didn't hurt anyone. I only gave Robert what he asked for." Brown pressed further, and Bell admitted that the judge was an alias he used to maintain control over his network of debtors. Robert Creel had been one of many. When Edwardine intervened, refusing to let her brother be exploited any further, Bell had issued a warning: either Robert found a way to pay, or there would be consequences. Armed with this new information, Brown pieced together the final grim truth. On the night of Edwardine's murder, Robert had contacted Mathers out of fear that Bell's enforcers were closing in. The confrontation between Robert, Edwardine, and Terry had spiraled out of control, but it was Bell's threats that had set the chain of events into motion. With enough evidence to indict Bell, Brown worked swiftly to dismantle his operation. The fallout was massive, with multiple arrests and financial seizures. Bell was charged with racketeering, conspiracy, and coercion, ensuring he would never wield power again. For Brown, the case had finally reached its end. The layers of deception, greed, and violence had been peeled back to reveal the true extent of the tragedy. Edwardine Williams' death wasn't just a family's nightmare, it was the result of a corrupt system that preyed on desperation. As he filed his final report, Brown reflected on the weight of justice. It had taken years, but the truth had been uncovered. For Edwardine's daughters, it meant they could finally begin to heal, knowing that every person responsible for their mother's death had been held accountable. For Brown, it was another reminder of why he pursued the truth, no matter how long it took. But even as he closed the file for the last time, he couldn't shake the feeling that, in the shadows of every solved case, another mystery was waiting to emerge.